Imagine a time when your basic human rights could be stripped away from you based on your performance on an IQ test, or simply because you live in poverty. Envision a government that could use these circumstances to justify taking something from you that is irreplaceable, your ability to have children. When and where could such injustice take place? The answer is closer to home than you may think. For decades in the 20th century, the United States was home to the largest eugenics program in the world. More than 30 states practice this controversial science, from California all the way to North Carolina. Operating from the 1930s to the 1970s, the Eugenics Board of North Carolina was the longest-running and most aggressive program in the nation. The board sought to improve the genes of the population through sterilization, an irreversible procedure. Their goal was to create a better society, free of people that might impede its progress. But the people never really had a choice. The impoverished, the feeble-minded, the promiscuous, and eventually the black population were viewed as an impairment to humanity, a burden that the future need not bear. So the board sterilized them, with the firm belief that they were stopping a problem before it started. Dr. Gail Turner is an educator and researcher at Appalachian State University in Western North Carolina. She has given lectures on the history of the eugenics program, and she explains the philosophy behind eugenics.
The whole idea behind eugenics is that, just like with cows, you can breed human beings so that we have better human beings. We want to build a better human being. And the problem is that all these stupid people are breeding. So we have to stop them from breeding, or the human race will go downhill. This was not Hitler's idea. It originated in the United States.
The origins of eugenics can be traced back to before World War I, to a psychiatrist named Robert Yerkes.
He got a contract with the U.S. Army to help them as they were inducting people into World War I. He did the first IQ tests. He found that, say in the South, people who had hookworm didn't perform as well. His conclusion was that people in the South, blacks, poor whites, were simply less intelligent. We know, however, that if you have hookworm, you're not getting the nutrition you need or anything, but he does not include that as any possibility for why that person didn't do as well on an IQ test.
The skewed results of these tests reflected the bias of the person who administered the test, and the information was used to reinforce their prejudiced beliefs.
So jump forward to the implementation of IQ testing following World War I. That is how these tests were used, to prove that the people who were already at the bottom belonged at the bottom of the social scale.
In 1927, the landmark Supreme Court decision Buck v. Bell legalized sterilization in the United States. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously wrote in the ruling about his attitudes towards sterilization.
This is what Holmes said, our illustrious justice. It's better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. This was the prevailing attitude of educated people in the United States.
Buck versus Bell opened the door for states like North Carolina to begin implementing their eugenics programs. After initially facing resistance due to the state constitution, which objected to sterilizations, the North Carolina General Assembly eventually removed these objections and created the Eugenics Board in 1933. The board had supreme authority over all sterilizations performed in the state. John Raley is the editorial page editor for the Winston-Salem Journal and was a contributor to the award-winning series Against Their Will about the eugenics program. He describes the board and its inner workings.
We had 5 board members. They were de facto. The Attorney General was there, the head of public welfare, the heads of the state mental hospitals, and because the governor didn't appoint them, it didn't get the public look it should have. It was hiding in plain sight. They're putting out cheery press releases, but nobody had an idea how bad it was. So they met once a month. Usually they'd rubber stamp every petition. They were going on IQ testing, which was designed primarily for middle-class white kids. So of course, underprivileged white children or black children aren't going to have the knowledge of the test. It didn't measure native intelligence.
The board's fundamental belief that they could eliminate negative genes from the population through sterilization led them to focus their work towards some of society's weakest individuals. Raley reveals just how many people were sterilized.
More than 7,600. These were men, women, and children, boys as young as 10 castrated. You read page after page of the records, and it's horrible. They were going for epileptics, the promiscuous, dwarfs, the blind, the deaf. I mean, so it was just across the board. It had its roots in, strangely enough, the progressive movement, and people really believed that this was a good thing.
The Eugenics Board continued to operate smoothly through the 1940s. After the conclusion of World War II, the atrocities of Hitler's death camps and eugenics experiments shocked the American public. Would this be enough to stop sterilization in the United States?
Many states, as they're watching Germans at the trials saying, I was just following orders, I'm not interested in eugenics, there was a sort of sense, I think, among the general populace that eugenics might not be such a good thing. They were stopped in other states, but in the state of North Carolina, we continued. And in fact, we sterilized more people following World War II than before World War II.
The chilling thing is, conventional wisdom says that our guys learned this from Hitler. But no, we taught Hitler this stuff. They learned this from us. They learned about setting up the legal framework. What Hitler did was strictly legal by the rules he set up. And it was the same way here. And everybody was just following orders and not asking questions.
As sterilizations continued into the 1950s and 60s, a disturbing trend began to emerge. Minorities, specifically black females, were being disproportionately targeted by the board.
By the 1950s, North Carolina just surges ahead and basically enters an American genocide. They're zeroing in on black women and girls on welfare, where the numbers before had been proportional to the general population. That's the terrible irony of this thing in the 1960s, that North Carolina was a state very progressive on race relations. Yet at the same time, underneath the radar screen, it's committing genocide against black women and girls.
In many cases, poor families felt that they had no choice but to surrender their loved ones to the procedure, or risk losing everything. Rayleigh recounts the story of Nile Cox Ramirez, a black woman who was sterilized in 1965.
North Carolina social workers had unique powers, unlike almost every other program in the state. They were the minions for the powerful and prominent to zone in on the poor and powerless. And they did this through the social workers. So now gets pregnant out of wedlock at 18, has one child, the state allowed her to have one child, and then the social worker just starts coming to see her almost on a weekly basis. Now would hear her clipping up her walk and just be terrified. And the woman just kept pressing her. If you don't do this, we'll take you off welfare. Your family's going to starve. She has to decide to do this. And she didn't really understand it. She was literally afraid her family would starve, even though they didn't have the power to take them off of welfare.
There are still many victims living today who continue to carry the weight of what the state did to them. Annie Bullen is one of them. Coming from a large, poor family, Bullen was sterilized in 1952 after performing poorly on an IQ test. She was only 13 years old.
They said they was going to fix me where I could never have any children because of my IQ and because we was poor. But Mama, she had to sign because she didn't have no education. I reckon she done what she thought was best. It makes me feel like I'm nothing because they've took something away from me that could never be replaced. And I would never know what it would be like to carry a baby 9 months and give birth to it and to hold it in my arms. I would never know what that would be like. It breaks my heart.
After more than 40 years of unchecked operation, the board was finally dissolved in the 1970s. Rayleigh believes that the times had just finally changed.
A lot of it was collapsing under the weight of modernity. Then you had alternative methods of birth control coming aboard, which weren't widely available then. It wasn't until 73, Roe versus Wade, that you had abortion. And then Nile and Elaine Riddick, Nile first, had become the first people in the nation to sue the state of North Carolina with the help of the ACLU. They both lost, but widespread publicity, and that helped collapse it. Finally, it disbanded in 74.
In 2012, North Carolina became the first of 32 states that practice eugenics to attempt to provide compensation for living victims. Unfortunately, the compensation package was struck down in the state Senate. Victims like Annie Bullen are still waiting for justice.
No matter what they gave me, it would not take this hurt away but I would like to have something.
I'm hoping that as the information is collected, more and more the people of North Carolina will think about themselves and think, how would I feel if that had happened to me? If somebody had decided I was a moron and then had sterilized me?
The eugenics program may not be a part of our history that we are proud of, but it is our utmost responsibility as citizens to acknowledge the past, out of respect for the victims, and as a lesson for the future. Until then, we can only hope that the victims will one day get justice. I'm Paul Shaver. Thanks for listening.